In this day and age, there are a lot of ways that we communicate with one another. Obviously, talking. We can even communicate with each other just by our eyes and our gestures, the motions of our head. Yes, no. We all know when our moms have rolled their eyes at us, um, shake their finger at us, all sorts of things give us insight into what somebody else is thinking. Now, with modern technology, we have cell phones that can make calls, that can video chat, that can send text messages, that can email. They have all ways to communicate. Paul didn't have those opportunities in first century Palestine. They communicated verbally and those non-communication things like we talked about, but they wrote letters to each other. And this chapter, 1 Corinthians 7, is a very good indicator on the fact that the church in Corinth had written Paul a letter confused about a lot of issues and wanting clarity. And so in the very first verse, Paul says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So he's returning correspondence to them. And he uses a quote from their letter. The ESV has this in quotation marks. Not many other translations do. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure any of them do. But he quotes something they wrote in a letter, which is, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Why would they write something like that? Well, if you think the marriage situation in 21st century America, or 22nd century America, whatever we're in, is complicated, it was complicated in Rome, simply because there were no marriage laws. None. Now, there were 6 different Roman or Greek words that the Romans used, or Latin words, to designate different types of relationships. But what we need to remember contextually is that many of the early Christians were slaves. They were slaves. And slavery didn't exist for them like we imagine slavery occurred in America years ago. Slavery usually was because someone had incurred a massive debt and couldn't pay it back. And you became a slave then to the person who held that note or had lend you the money until you could pay it back. And with Christians, many of them in the early church realized that even that was wrong. And so they allowed people that were in slavery to them to be freedmen. So there was a lot of confusion about relationships. And they didn't know what to do because so many of those slaves were living together. You say, what? And they just were sexual partners. And that was allowed by the slave owner. There was a term that meant sharing of a tent. And the slave owner could allow a man to share his tent with a woman. And at any given time, he could say, oh, no, I'm selling her, or I'm moving her out, whatever. He could change the situation. So it wasn't up to them. And we know Paul has written that we're not to be unequally yoked. We're to be loyal to our vows if we're married. They didn't know what to do. So much like in the 1800s, how many of you have heard of the Shakers? Yeah, the Shakers, I can't remember the lady's last name. I think it is Mary Beth something. Were formed by this woman, and she decided that the best way to stay righteous was for everybody to abstain from sex. It didn't last very long. Okay, it's just not going to with men and women. It died out. That movement did, and we understand why. We've talked about the natural urges and our hormones and all that. We've discussed sex for weeks now, it seems like, and again, this is the basis of our discussion is sex or lack thereof, because in God's eyes, this is a very black and white subject. There are two classifications of people when it comes to relationships. You are either a single person or you're a married person. Now, who knows what God's definition of marriage is? Anyone? A union between a man and a woman. Joined together, one flesh. And what the preacher says at the wedding is, what God has ordained, let no man separate. Right? So it's very simple. You're either single or you're married. But the Corinthians are thinking like the Shakers, hey, the way we can deal with this is let's just not have sex. Let's just completely abstain. That'll work, right, Paul? So they wrote him. Well, Paul says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Well, there's some clarity. So in the context of marriage, you're not going to necessarily face the temptation of sexual immorality where you were single. Is that true? Kinda. I mean, we know what Paul's saying, but that doesn't work for everybody, does it? It does not. It does not. And he says the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. Get this. When you get married, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Ladies, aren't you glad it doesn't stop right there? Likewise, Paul says, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. What's he trying to say to us? Honey, I have a headache. Too bad. No, that's not what he's saying. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, let's not use sex as a weapon. Let's not weaponize sex in our relationship. Oh, you've been mean to me? Guess what? Out of my bed. And we're going to put it on the calendar 3 weeks from today, and maybe I'll let you off the hook. We cannot do that. Okay, we cannot use something that God has designed for a beautiful purpose to be weaponized in a marriage to lord over one another. Okay? And women, I can't speak from your perspective, but I can speak from a man's perspective. The men are built differently than women. And like I said last week, we're a lot like bulls. We were created for a purpose. Paul says, do not deprive one another, except by agreement for a limited time that you may devote yourselves to prayer or fasting. But then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. That does not mean that when your husband's in the mood or your wife's in the mood, you can say, I'm praying. I'm fasting from that. That's not what Paul's saying. He's saying, you two need to decide together that we need to concentrate on something in our marriage. Or we need to concentrate on a purpose spiritually for somebody else, a time of prayer. So we are going to abstain for a time, and you agree on the time, so we can devote ourselves to that. So our thoughts can be strictly on that. But it needs to be agreed upon. And then Paul says, when that time's up, you need to come back together again. Well, why? because Satan knows what you need just like you know what you need. And he's going to use it against you. If the wife says, I'm fasting from sex for 2 months, I guarantee you after a week, if the husband's not agreeable to that or in on that, he's going to start having thoughts that he shouldn't have. Listen, in our culture, sex is everywhere. We can't turn on TV. We cannot listen to the radio. We cannot go on the internet. We cannot read a book without sex being part of the subject matter. It's just the time we live in, and it's always been the time we've lived in. Okay, this is nothing new, but Satan will use your weakness against you. All right, so obviously, Paul starts off with this idea of husband and wife. By the way, he's going to discuss about 10 different scenarios here. So we're all included in this. Praise the Lord. Okay, so the first category is the regular God-ordained marriage, husband and wife, man and woman. Married. Okay, anybody have any questions about that? We're all good with how God sees marriage and how he intends marriage to work. A union, one flesh for life. And we talked last week about how that one flesh is more than just physical. It's a spiritual bonding for life. For life. And if you cheat on that in any way or take on a different relationship with someone else, that all changes. But aren't we glad that we have a God of grace that knows things happen? Things happen. Now, back in the Gospels, Jesus talked about this. The Pharisees were trying to trick him and talking about marriage, and he said, hey, if a guy has 7 wives, who the Pharisee says, who's going to be his wife in heaven? And Jesus said, hey, in heaven there is no marrying or giving in marriage. That's not something that exists in heaven. And so then they talk about divorce to Jesus, and they're trying to trap him. And there are 2 schools of thoughts that the Jewish rabbis taught. There was a really liberal and a really conservative thought pattern. These 2 schools, Hillel and Gamaliel. One was, you can only divorce your wife if she's unfaithful, sexual immorality. The other was, you can divorce your wife if she burns your toast and that makes you mad. For any reason whatsoever. So they come to Jesus and says, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? And they're trying to trick him because Moses was very clear about this. Only adultery. And Jesus says, Moses allowed divorce because of your hard hearts. But it wasn't that way in the beginning. So Jesus goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, and God created one flesh, and he's saying this is how it's supposed to be. And he clearly says God hates divorce. Now as a concession, so Paul says, look, I know you want to all abstain from sex, and you think that's going to fix it. But he says, as a concession, not as a command. I'm not commanding this. I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am. But each one has his own gift from God. One of one kind and one of another. What's this tell us about Paul? Paul's single. Paul is single. Now, has Paul been married before? There's a lot of talk about this. First of all, in Acts chapter 8, we have the scenario where Stephen is stoned. And Saul of Tarsus casts his vote, it says, in agreement that Stephen be stoned to death. Now that would indicate, it doesn't come right out and say, but it indicates that Saul of Tarsus was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And if he was, the number one rule to be a member of the Sanhedrin was you have to be married. But we have no record of that being for sure the case. We have no record of Paul talking about a wife or a widow or any of that. But now he's single. And he says, I wish that all were as I myself am. So he's saying, hey, best case scenario, stay single. But you got to have the gift. What's that gift? It's called self-control. If you're going to be single, you have to have your body, your temptations, all those things under control, or it won't work. And not everybody has that gift. As a matter of fact, very, very few people have that gift. Okay? Not everybody has the gift of prophesying. Not everybody has the gift of healing. Okay? These are special gifts given by God. And marriage is a gift. Okay? And not everybody can handle marriage either. It's a gift. It's a gift. To the unmarried and widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. Okay, we know what a widow or a widower is, right? It's somebody that's been married and their spouse dies. Who's the unmarried? Because he's going to use a different term, betrothed or virgin, in a little bit. Who are the unmarried? Those people that are divorced. It was very common in that culture. It's very common today. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So, if you've been married, you lose your spouse to death, or you're divorced, Paul says you should remarry, because if you're going to burn with passion, it's going to cause you to sin. Remember, Jesus defined adultery as lustful intent in our heart, not necessarily the action. Okay? So, there we have our second situation of singleness. We have widows and divorced. Now he's going to throw a stipulation on this at the very end of the chapter. You can't just marry anybody. To the married, I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. So Paul's going to say here, this is a little confusing to people because he says, not I, but the Lord. Then he says, not the Lord, but I. Basically, Paul's saying, Jesus has spoke about this. Pretty soon he's going to say, Jesus hasn't spoke about this, but I'm spiritually inspired, and my word comes from God. Okay, so don't dismiss anything as Paul says as being something that's not inspired, because our whole scripture is inspired. Paul's just, at this point, quoting Jesus. He says, the wife should not separate from her husband. So Jesus says, you shouldn't divorce. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. So, what would be a reason for a woman or a man to want out of a marriage other than adultery? What's Paul insinuating is allowable here? He says she should remain unmarried. If she does leave, I think abuse. Okay, physical, mental. Some people come to a point in their marriage, they can't even be in the same room. Scary circumstances sometimes. Life-threatening. They have to get out of there. Now, that's typically an abusive husband, but I'm a firm believer there are other reasons, like, let's say, a wife becomes addicted to drugs. And the people she runs with, the money she's spending, maybe she's selling drugs, that starts endangering the life of the husband. And he can't get her to quit. Got to get out of there. Okay, but you should remain unmarried, and maybe in the future you can be reconciled. Okay, so that's a special situation. I'm going to write that up as abuse. And it works for the man or the woman. Paul says husband a lot, or you get the idea that Paul's blaming the wife, but he's not. Okay, the culture was very man-centric, right? Many of the women were illiterate, so he's typically writing his letters to men. It was just a different time, a different culture. All right, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. So this is coming from me. And this is more than just Paul's opinion. That if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Okay, so here's a scenario. We have a couple. One of them starts coming to church. Because as Christians, we don't start out unequally yoked, right? Unfortunately, sometimes we do. We're not supposed to. Okay. My first marriage, I married a Christian. She was Catholic and a non-practicing Catholic, and we were unequally yoked. The second time, I met Wendy at Restoration Church. Well, wowzer. Look at her. We had already met, but that's when I really noticed her. So Paul's saying, if your husband isn't a believer, you become a believer, you don't have to divorce him. Stay as you are. If the husband becomes a believer, the wife is not, and she wants to stay, she's fine with your religion, all that's good, stay. You don't have to get divorced. All right, so this would be new believers. Because the Corinthians, many of them were new to Christianity. Christ hadn't died too long ago. They're like, what do we do? My spouse is a heathen, a pagan. I got to get out of there. Paul says, no. If he's fine with your relationship with the Lord, stay there. And listen, he gives a reason why. For the unbelieving husband is made holy. He's set apart. He has a special grace because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Set apart. Special grace. This does not mean that your salvation extends to your unbelieving husband or your unbelieving wife. That is not what Paul's saying. But at the very least, he's saying that your unbelieving spouse is going to be influenced by your Christianity in a positive way. But it goes further than that. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. Wow. What's the importance of Christianity in a home as it is passed on to the child. Okay, if you have a family, you become a believer, the rest of your family is not, God's going to have a good impact on your husband, but your children too. Now, there are those biblical scholars that think Paul is indicating here that the salvation of a believing Christian in the home covers the salvation of an innocent child until the time of accountability. I don't know. Personally, I don't think that's what Paul's saying, because I think all children are innocent until they reach the accountability age. The advantage would be to be raised by Christian parents, so they would know the difference. Weaning your child in the pews is a great thing. We need to encourage parents and grandparents to grab those kids by the hand and bring them to church and Sunday school, to understand the family unit as God intended it, to understand the fellowship and the relationship we have with one another. But, Paul says, you become a Christian, your spouse isn't, and the unbelieving partner separates. I don't want anything to do with your Christianity. All your praying and Bible reading is driving me nuts. I'm out of here. Paul says, let it be so. Let him go. Don't fight it. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. What's that mean? You're free to remarry. You're free to remarry. You're not bound anymore to that unbeliever who left you. Let him go. This is such a beautiful verse. Why? Because God has called you to peace. If your spouse is fighting you tooth and nail on your Christianity and your faith and your dedication to it, it's going to wear you out. It's going to undo what Jesus has done. God has called you to peace. Let them go. And you say, wait a minute, I'm the only person in the world that could save him. 16 says, for you do not know, for how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Be pretty arrogant to think that we were the only person that could reach our unbelieving spouse. That's not how it works. You guys know, you invest in somebody, maybe they receive that investment, maybe not. The next person, they invest in that same person, and it goes a little better. The third person, it goes a little better. The fourth person, pretty soon they're being baptized. We don't know. We just plant seeds. Okay, God does the watering. So we don't know whether if we fought them tooth and nail at court and says, I will not divorce you. I'll fight you to the bitter end. So I love you. I want to save you. Let them go. Let them go. Have peace. Have peace. Well, we're going to skip this middle section. We'll come back to it probably next week. Now, concerning the betrothed. The betrothed are the virgins, men or women. Those that are single, and God's definition of single is never had sex. Simply. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord. Here's where we know Paul is speaking inspirationally, or definitely knows he is, believes he is. But I give my judgment as one by whom the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. God trusts me to share this merciful advice with you. I think that in view of the present distress It is good for a person to remain as he is. What's the present distress Paul's talking about? I think that in view of the present distress, Christians were starting to be persecuted. And in about 10 years from this letter, Christians start getting fed to lions, lit up as candles in the emperor's courtyard. I think if you're a virgin, I think if you're married, either way, I think right now it's good for a person to remain as he is, because trouble's coming. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. See, here's what happens. The emperor sends his soldiers to your house and says, "We hear you're a Christian. We hear your wife's a Christian. You're either going to recant your testimony, disavow your faith, or we're going to kill your wife." See, that complicates the matter. So this virgin's wondering, should I get married? Should I not get married? Paul says, I think it's better if you just stay as you are, because if you become married, that complicates your situation because you involve the protection of another person. So, if you're married, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Just stay as you are, because you know where you're at. You know what you can handle. But if you do marry, you haven't sinned. He says, this is all optional. Single, betrothed. I forgot to put that up there. That's who we're talking about. Virgins, if you do marry, you haven't sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I will spare you of that. Married couples, do you have worldly troubles? Yeah, because you can't strictly focus on the Lord. You have somebody else in your life that you need to please and be a servant of. Heard a funny story. How many of you have seen the recent movie that Kelsey Grammer plays Chuck Smith in Jesus Revolution? Yeah, okay. Chuck Smith, by the way, he has a lot of sermons online, and I listened to his sermon on 1 Corinthians 7, and he talked about this, and he said, when I was a single guy, just got into ministry, he says, I drove from California to Missouri. He said, I had a bag of apricots. That's all I needed. And when I got tired, I pulled over and I went to sleep. And I drove. Made good time. And then he starts talking about his wife. He said, we were coming back once we were married years later. And he said, Kay indicated to me that she was getting hungry and that she would like a cup of coffee. And I thought, that'll take an hour. He said, but we stopped. I stopped. And then at the end of his sermon, after they'd sang their song and they'd prayed, he did a little end note. He said, Kay and I are to the point in our relationship now where she's satisfied with a box of crackers from the grocery store and a little cheese, and we just go. I thought that was funny. But yeah, when you have a spouse, you have other obligations other than serving the Lord. When you're single, you can focus purely on serving the Lord. You don't have to worry about pleasing anybody else. Does that mean the world doesn't enter into your life? Of course not, because it does. Even singles deal with the world. Okay, but he says, If you marry, you'll have worldly troubles, and I'll spare you of that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. Trouble's coming. Trouble's coming. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. Yes, the men say. Listen to that. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. Don't take that too far. Okay? He's saying, trouble's coming. Devote your life to the Lord. It's not saying ignore your wife. He's saying stay devoted to the Lord. And those who mourn, as though they were not mourning. You don't have time to cry and whine around. You've got work to do for the Lord. You have to focus. And those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing. You don't have time to party and have leisure. You need to focus on serving the Lord. And those who buy as though they have no goods. And those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. Jesus is coming. He is coming. And as Christians, we have a great responsibility and duty to Him. The mission's laid out very clear, although it's in Chinese over here, I think. The Great Commission. That has not changed for us. I want you to be free from anxieties. How many of you worry about your spouse? Yeah. It's natural for us to worry about our spouse. If you're married. The unmarried thing is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. So the person that's single cannot be distracted by the anxiety of worrying about their spouse. See, the minute you take on a spouse, you enter into a family unit. You say, well, I thought you had to have kids to have a family. No. It just takes two. A man and a woman. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. Chuck Smith just needed a bag of apricots. He was good to go. Listen. She could probably still hear me. We get in the car to go to Kansas City. Wendy's got this bag, this travel bag. There's Kleenex in there, I know. There's lens wipes. There's baby wipes. There's newspapers to read, magazines to read. There's snacks to eat. Bottles of water and soda maybe around the outside of the bag. If we're going anywhere, that bag's coming with us. I'm grateful for the bag. But I could get by on a bag of apricots, even though I don't like them. I need a Coke or a Pepsi, probably a cherry Pepsi, a fountain is best, from Love's Truck Stop. A bag of Twizzlers and a bag of ranch corn nuts, and I'm good for miles and miles. I don't have to stop. Well, yeah, there comes a time, I'm older, when I gotta stop. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious of things about the Lord. So when you're single, you're only worried about things of the Lord. How to be holy in body and in spirit. How to be set apart as a single person. If Paul would have had a wife living, I'm assuming Paul Paul is a widower. However, when he was converted and on the road to Damascus, when Jesus blinded him and he became a Christian, if he was married at that point and he came home and told Mama, my name's now Paul, I'm no longer a member of the Sanhedrin and Judaism, I've moved on from that. I don't serve Jehovah God like I did. Now I serve Jesus. You know, the one that was crucified as a criminal, yeah, that's my Lord. She could have walked out. I don't know. We don't know. But Paul says if you're single, you can focus on how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things. I'm getting hungry. I need a cup of coffee. We need to pull over. How to please her husband. Wait a minute. What I just said was she was wanting to please herself. She wanted to pull over and get a cup of coffee and something to eat. Paul's saying she's usually worried about how to please her husband. And I think that's true. There's so many times that even when we're traveling, to stay on that topic, Wendy makes all kinds of concessions for me. You know, like, you need to go to the bathroom. Well, I can wait. And I'm using a very, very tiny example for us here. Okay, a woman is anxious about how to please her husband. And I hope we as husbands are anxious about how to please our wives. We want to make each other happy. And sometimes that extends far beyond the spiritual or our relationship with the Lord because we're very worldly people. And he says, I say this for your own benefit. Do not lay any restraint on you, but to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So, I'm not trying to guilt you here at all, but for you to have peace so that you can focus on the Lord. If you don't have peace in your relationship, whether you're single or married, if you don't have peace with who you are, how are you going to effectively serve the Lord? Because you can be single or married and be devoted to the Lord. Either way is okay. Remember, they started with, it's good for a man not to sleep with a woman. That's what we're going to do. And Paul's saying it's not that simple. There's a lot of ways to have goodness relationally. All right. This is this was a hard one for me. This is the last section. Again, this is about virgins. But there were some dads in Corinth, some fathers, who said, you know what? I'm going to spare my daughter of this garbage. I'm going to keep her holy. I am not going to give her in marriage. I'm going to keep her at home. I'm going to take care of her so she can focus on serving the Lord. That was the custom that the fathers gave their daughters. There's usually a dowry involved that the projected fiance would give to the father to buy his wife. It was a gesture. It wasn't, but the father could reject a dowry. Okay, but he's just saying we're not even going to get there. I'm just going to keep her at home, keep her special, keep her pure. I'm going to save her from all that mess of that guy and the road he's been down and what a jerk and millions of possibilities. He's got to pass. I'm not going to give her into that. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly to his virgin daughter, the betrothed, and if his passions are strong, and it has to be, I'm not going to let her, let him do it as he wishes. So he's saying the father's not wrong. However, there are a lot of fathers and daughters these days making covenants of abstinence and purity. That's great with 7 and 8-year-old girls. That's awesome. But something changes in girls at about 11, 12, 13. They change. God changes them into not a machine, but into a very special creature that's able to carry and produce another one. And motherhood is instinctual in so many women, and so many women it's not. And it's okay either way. But Dad, if your little girl turns 13, and that was the marrying age in that culture in those days, they gave them away early. Let them marry. It is no sin. What if you're fighting in your mind now, Dad, that maybe I made a mistake. I see she wants a husband, but we made this vow, and I think I'm doing her wrong now by keeping her at home. I said, it's okay. You're not sinning if you let her marry. That promise can be put aside. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, he has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. Listen, if she wants to stay single and you want to support her in that and take care of her, because listen, that's why women married, not only to have a family, but they needed someone to support them because it wasn't the economy of today. Most women, if they weren't married, how did they make their money? I hate to tell you, in that culture, it was prostitution. As a dad, wouldn't you want to protect your daughter from that? He will do well. That dad will do well if he's firmly established this in his heart because he knows his daughter, she doesn't want to marry. You, sir, have the obligation of taking care of your daughter in your home. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. About to finish up. I know this is long. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. You get that? God hates divorce. But if the husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes. Okay, so widows, widowers, your spouse dies, you're free to marry again. If your unbelieving partner leaves you because of your faith, Paul says, let them go. You are no longer bound. So I think the situation applies both ways here. To those who have been divorced because of an unbelieving spouse that left or a spouse that has died. You're free to marry on one condition. Only in the Lord. Don't repeat that mistake again and allow an unbelieving person to leave you again. Marry somebody that's a Christian. Marry someone that's a Christian. Yet, if she's single, in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. So we've seen this played out even in our church. Widow, widower, someone who's divorced from an unbelieving spouse. Some have remarried, some have not. And guess what? It's okay. It's okay. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So there Paul is reconfirming that I'm speaking spiritually. All right. Now here it comes. You say, Alan, all good advice from Paul. I've messed it all up. I've messed it all up. Where do I stand with God? Got a clean ledger. You're the only one remembering your sinful issue. God isn't. God wants us to have lives of peace. That's why all these provisions and instructions have been given, because our relationships get complicated. And we don't know where we stand with God. I've made a mistake. Maybe you cheated. Maybe your spouse cheated. Maybe they left. Who knows? Maybe you've been guilty of sexual immorality. God's grace is so awesome because He's forgiven all of that. Forgive yourself. There's a song that I love called Chasing Cars. I've asked my kids to play it at my funeral. And there's a line in there that says, I need your grace to give myself grace. Understand that you've been forgiven so you can receive grace. And when you get that, you should be able to forgive yourself. If God can forgive you, can't you forgive you? Can't you go on? What did Jesus tell the woman that was caught in adultery? Where are the people that condemn you? I don't condemn you. I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. Okay? If you've messed it up, fine. Can you take that back? No. Jesus says, try to live right now. That's all we can do, folks. We've all messed up. We've all messed up. It's okay. And if you think you're messing up again by marrying this one or staying single, it's not sinning. There's pretty clear instruction here, don't you think? Very practical advice for us. I look out here among us, and all of us, whether we've been the one who's been divorced, our spouse may have been divorced. We've entered into complicated relationships, and we've messed it up. We haven't done it by God's design. He's forgiven you. He's forgiven me. The blood of Christ covers it all. That's hard to accept, I know, but that's how pure Jesus' blood is. We go to this time of communion where we remember how precious His body and His blood was given up for us. And He commands us to eat from the bread, to drink His blood in remembrance of His death, because that was the price where we could have peace. Don't beat yourself up. I did that for years. I don't do that anymore. It's a lot more fun, and it's a lot more loving when you quit beating yourself up. But I will offer this word of advice to the single people who are thinking about getting married. Don't wait. Don't come to me and say, hey, we're engaged, we're getting married 2 years from September. That's not going to work. It's hard to stay pure. Most of us don't. I remember Wendy and I getting ready to get married, and we wanted to do things right even though we weren't. We went to Gene Weiss to ask him to marry us, and he was so happy that we were getting married and counseled us. And he said, and I want to challenge you. He said, I know you're living together. He said, but I want to challenge you to abstain until your wedding night, from now to then. He said, that'll make it special. It did. It did. So, we want to try to do what's right. Okay, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this wonderful chapter in Corinthians that addresses so many issues of our life and our love life, our sexual life. We can get so confused by what the world says is okay or isn't okay, and there's not much the world says that isn't okay these days. It's kind of a free-for-all right now, and that is absolutely not how you intended the family unit to exist, to flourish. If we would stick to your model to the best of our ability, whether we've messed it up in the past or in the process of messing up, if we would just focus on your model of being single or being married and give glory to that style of relationship, that type of living, give glory to you for the instruction and the purpose, we would have such peace. We would have such unending love here on earth. We could be free of guilt. We could be free of anxiety, knowing that we're doing things right and we're focusing on you. And for the people that are married and are getting married, Father, I pray that they're doing it together. That they're living this life as a Christian together, because there's purity in singleness. And I glorify you for those that are single. And Father, there's purity in the family, whether there's children involved or not. But when the family, the home is founded on Christ, everything goes well. Thank you for loving us and forgiving us.